of policy analysis for California education, and CASE. And CASE is leading up the dissemination efforts around getting down to facts. And this set of studies that Deborah is going to discuss today is part of that ambitious effort. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of that work and kind of how the early childhood piece is situated within. So what is Getting Down to Facts 2? It's a national collaborative research study that is really designed to span all of pre-K-12 to pre-K-12 education. The goal really being, what do we know about how we're doing as a system? What have we done well? And where do we still need to improve? The idea is that we're in this moment of incredible transition here in California with a new governor, with a new state superintendent of public instruction, and really after a lot of reform. And so the time is right now to take stock across our entire system of where we are. It's a sequel to the Getting Down to Facts 1 study that was about 10 years ago that many point to as being instrumental in some of the changes that we have experienced around the local control funding formula and changes to our accountability system. And so part of our goal here as well was to provide the next set of evidence that will launch policy decisions that occur over the next 10 years. And so this conversation here is one of many that we're having around the state with key decision makers about what to do next based on this evidence. The studies that you'll hear about in Getting Down to Facts and that you'll hear about today with the early childhood piece are the result of a lot of stakeholder outreach, both in terms of feedback to the research, but also as subjects of the research. We talked to lots of practitioners and policymakers all across the system, across the state, to really be able to represent what was happening and how different people with different perspectives are experiencing the work. Ultimately, all of this research, which has over 100 researchers participating, 36 research studies, which we compiled into 19 research briefs and 1 summary report. So if you haven't checked out that overarching material, I would highly encourage you to do so. So studies fall into 4 different areas. We looked at student success, governance, personnel, and finance. The studies that you'll be hearing about today by Deborah Stipek actually cover all of these areas to some degree. But I think that's an important piece of the set of research that she'll be sharing. So just very quickly, what are the key findings from Getting Down to Facts 2, just so that you can kind of orient your mind to this overarching message before we dig into early childhood. So the first is that California schools and districts are on the right track. The changes that we've put into place in the past 10 years, not only are they starting to show some positive results, but also there's widespread support across the state for the local control funding formula, for the common core state standards, for the accountability system. But there's still a need to put new things into place that build the capacity for us to take advantage of all of these changes at scale. Some of these things specifically are focusing on building on the current reforms, building local capacity in order to execute all of these changes that we've put into place. We also have not yet gotten to a point of funding where many would say that we're sufficiently funded as a system to meet the needs of our state in order to fully realize the goals that we set. Similarly, there are many systems, particularly in early childhood education, which you'll hear about today, that need attention in order to support improvement at scale. And finally, despite changes in all of these systems, we still are experiencing large achievement gaps in our state that need constant attention. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Deborah Stipek, who is a professor at Stanford University. I won't read her bio, I'll let you take a look at it. An esteemed researcher in early childhood education, a faculty director of CASE, and I'm really glad that we have you all in the room today to interact with her about her research. So join me in welcoming Deborah.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm also very grateful to all of you for coming out on a pretty smoky day to hear about early childhood. Just a couple of things about early childhood in comparison to K-12. K-12, we have experienced some pretty major reforms in the state over the last decade, and so much of what Getting Down to Facts was doing is looking at what have those reforms done, and what more do we need to do to really get to where we need to be? Early childhood, in contrast to K-12, has not experienced reforms. In fact, I think this is a strong word, but I would say it has languished a bit over the last decade, while other states have invested much more in the early learning space. So California, a few decades ago, was one of the leaders, one of the models of programming for young children. It has now fallen way behind. So in many respects, a lot of the work that I was doing was trying to figure out where are the biggest problems and what are some of the potential solutions or ways to address some of the problems that we have in the state. That's not to say that we've done nothing. It's just to say that compared to K-12, we have not had the same kind of major reforms. The other thing I wanted to mention, which comes from one of the other reports in Getting Down to Facts, the one that was done on the achievement gap, found that California has a larger achievement gap than most other states. But if you look at the learning trajectories of children through K-12, the learning trajectories, actually the kids are learning at about an average amount compared to other states. So then the question is, why do we have such a huge achievement gap, so much larger than other states, if they're making the same kinds of achievement gains through their education? Well, the reason is that though that gap exists before they even enter school. It exists when they start kindergarten. So one of the reasons California has a very large achievement gap is that we have a very large achievement gap for children who are entering kindergarten. It points a finger, I think, to the importance of investing in early childhood if one of the things that we want to address in the state is that achievement gap, not to mention all the other reasons why we want to invest in young children. The work that I and my colleagues did spanned a lot of different topics. One of the things I wanted to mention is that they did not look at other areas or domains that do, in fact, influence children's learning. Their health, for example, social services, foster care policies, and that sort of thing. These all have indirect effects on children's learning. We really focused on the things, the policies that have the most direct effects, for no other reason than simply to make the task manageable. So these are the topics that are in the study. So I'm going to start with the first topic. What I plan to do is just go through and give you some of the highlights of some of the findings on these various topics, and then hope to have some time to have some conversation about what the next step is with this work. So just a reminder. How's that? Just a reminder, I think it's really important, we all know this, but just to remind us who are California's young children. They are a majority minority. Many of them are in immigrant families, and a third of the children who enter kindergarten are dual language learners. We have a pretty high poverty rate. 1 in 5 children are below the poverty line, and nearly half are what we call near poverty, which is the 200% of the poverty line. So we have a lot of children who are who don't have access to resources through their families. Some of you may have seen this. This is from the Learning Policy Institute. It is fondly referred to as the subway system of early childhood. And you don't have to, I'm not going to test you on all these little pieces, although some of the people in the room actually know them. But the point is simply that there are many agencies at many levels that are in the early learning space. And one of the challenges is trying to create, that I think California has, is trying to create a little more coherence and a little more streamlining. We're going to talk about that more when we get to talking about different monitoring and evaluation systems and things like that. But it creates something of a nightmare for a parent who's trying to figure out what they're eligible for. And because many providers who are meeting children's needs also need to meet parents' needs, and so they're braiding funding from different sources, and with along with the different funding sources come different sets of accountability and requirements and monitoring and so on. So it creates something of a nightmare for both parents and for providers. The other thing to know is that California is not meeting the needs we have, especially for children birth to 3. It is very difficult to find affordable childcare for children birth to 3. We have 2.5 million children birth to age 5 in California. 1 million of these are qualified for subsidized early childhood education, but only about a third of them who are eligible are actually served. Now, there are reasons for this, which are not problems with the policy, but parents decide on other kinds of ways of meeting their children's needs for care. But we also know that there are many, many families who are struggling because they can't find anything that is affordable. Now, there's a lot of reasons for the fact that we have unmet needs. One is that we have relatively low reimbursement rates, which means low pay. And so we have staffing shortages. Facilities are incredibly expensive, and there are not resources that child care providers are able to actually access to be able to meet the facility needs. There's a huge variability in the supply. Rural options are very limited. And you have changing demographics, so it may be that you've got a community where they are meeting the need, but then there's an influx of families, and so you're not anymore. But on the other hand, there are no facilities or staff to be able to meet the increased need. One of the things I was going to mention is that the programs, the family child care programs, which are the most affordable for families, have decreased substantially in California. So just between 2014 and 2016, the number of slots went down by 9%. That's a pretty big amount when the demand did not go down. Also, we don't necessarily provide services in the way that parents need them. So full-day preschool is very scarce. And to the degree that it exists, it requires braiding funds from different sources, which become very complicated. Half-day preschool really is problematic for most parents. I don't know about you, but most parents don't work for 3 or 4 hours. I'd like to get my same pay, but work for 3 or 4 hours. That's not going to happen. So it's really difficult for a family to even put their children in pre-K, because then they have to figure out how to get them from pre-K to some other sort of provider. So that's a problem. I know that there are slots around me in the Bay Area in pre-K programs that are going unfilled because there aren't enough families who can make a half-day program work. Plus, we have a huge increase, as you probably know, in California and in the nation, in people who are working weekends and odd hours and that sort of thing. And for the most part, our system of childcare is not very adaptable to that. And it's really expensive. So in California, the median family income is $64,000. Does anybody want to guess what infant child care costs on average? Somebody must be paying for it, right? It's about 20% of the median income, and in some communities it's 30%. Well, that's a lot, that's a big chunk of the income, and remember, that's the median income. Half the people in California have incomes that are less than that. So I want to go on to the issue of quality. Access is clearly an important issue, and access to affordable programs, but we also want that access to be to programs that are going to promote children's development, as well as meet families' needs, who are going to prepare children well for kindergarten, and who are going to help, and programs that are going to help close that gigantic achievement gap that we have in California. We have essentially two levers for quality control, so to speak. One of the levers is the standards for licensing. So when a program is licensed, it has to meet certain standards. So that's one way we can ensure some level of quality. But what you can see from this slide is that the standards vary hugely. So this is just for 4-year-olds, depending on what kind of program they're in. So I'm going to talk more about the teacher requirements, but even the staff-to-child ratio requirements vary hugely, whether there is any requirement for curriculum or evidence that there's a kind of developmentally appropriate learning program that's involved, vary from program to program. And we have many children in California who are in license-exempt care. That's that top line, where there are essentially no quality requirements. California ranks 11th of the 50 states for having a high percentage of children in subsidized license-exempt childcare. And I want to emphasize subsidized because taxpayers' money is actually going to subsidize children in programs that have essentially no quality control at all. The other strategy we have for ensuring or improving quality is basically quality improvement strategies. So California offers a lot of professional development and other ways for people who are working in early childhood to develop their skills and for programs to get better. The major lever we have in California is QRIS, the Quality Rating and Improvement System. There's two pieces to QRIS. The QR is the quality rating. The programs that participate have someone visit them, they collect a lot of data, and they're essentially measured, their quality is measured on a variety of dimensions. And then out of those ratings on those specific dimensions comes a quality rating. We do not have a statewide quality rating system. We have basically 58 systems because it's administered at the county level. Now it turns out that we've made some progress so that there is among some counties there's an agreement about what variables or what criteria are included in their QRIS, but not complete agreement. So there is no way in California we can track improvement because they're not comparable. They're apples and oranges. So one of the things that we could do if we wanted to be able to track the improvement in the California as a state is to at least have a core set of dimensions that all counties would agree to, which is actually sort of happening. The idea between QRIS in part is a kind of market idea that we will rate programs, we'll publish those ratings, and parents will choose those programs that have the highest ratings. And the ones that have low ratings will sort of disappear. So it's a way of controlling quality through the market. There are a variety of reasons why it doesn't actually work. One is in California, in most places, we don't actually make the ratings available to parents easily. And another is that in most communities, parents don't have a lot of choice. So they could say, gee, this program, which is the only one we can afford, that we can get our child to, has a very low quality rating, but what else are we going to do? And that's the situation that many parents are in. But certainly, we at least, if we want this market approach to work, we've got to make it available to parents. We also have in California a very low participation rate in QRIS. Only 29% of licensed child care centers and only 7% of family care homes were participating as of last fall. That's very low compared to most states. There's a reason why we have low participation. One is that it's voluntary, although that's true for most states. Two is that we don't really have incentives to participate. It's a lot of trouble and a lot of work for the administrators and the teachers. And what you get for it is basically some resources for professional development. That's the IS part, the improvement system part. So you have to really want to improve and be willing to put a lot of time and effort into having access to fairly minimal resources. What most states do is they have what's called a tiered reimbursement rate. They pay more to programs that have achieved a higher rating. So there's a strong incentive to trying, first for participating, and secondly for trying to improve your rating. And there's some research that suggests that that does work if the incentives are substantial. And because we don't really do anything with these ratings, we don't share them with parents, there's no real consequences. The other problem with QRIS in California is that it needs some work. One is it applies very poorly to family home caregiving situations, and which is one of the reasons why we have such low participation rate, because they know they're going to get a low score almost no matter what they do, because it's really oriented toward center programs. There are also a number of measures that are used, like classroom observation measures, child assessment measures, that I think the research is not wholly supportive of. So it just needs some work. Now, I know a lot of people in the field, because they've been dissatisfied with the research on QRIS across the country, are ready to throw it out. I'm not ready to throw it out because it's really our only lever we have. But I do think we need to work on it as a state and figure out how to make it work better. Okay, moving right along. I hope I'm talking fast and going through a lot of material, but I figure this is just basically food for conversation, right? By the way, speaking of food, if you want to get up and get more food or coffee or something like that, feel free. It doesn't bother me at all. Okay, turning to teacher preparation or provider preparation. The training requirements in California for directors, when I looked across states, they're fairly similar. They're not particularly high, they're not particularly low. They're kind of typical of what most states have. One of the things that's happening in California and other states as well is preschools are increasingly moving to be under the leadership of the elementary school principal. There are a number of districts now where that's becoming increasingly the norm. We've done some research in a couple of different districts and found that in districts where there's no specific training and support for principals in early childhood education, it doesn't work well. The principals don't like it. They feel unprepared. They will say to us, I'm supposed to be evaluating preschool teachers. I don't know what preschool teachers are supposed to do. And so in some cases, what the preschool, instead of achieving greater alignment between preschool and the elementary school, which is one of the purposes of putting the principal over both, the preschool becomes kind of the neglected stepchild, because they don't have a director who's advocating and working on their behalf, and the principal really doesn't know how. In contrast, in one of the districts that we're working, they really worked hard. They provided a lot of professional development for their elementary school principals in early childhood education. And they were eager. They spent time visiting classrooms. They talked to us a lot about how they learned things in preschool that they wanted their kindergarten and their first grade to pick up, a greater amount of child-initiated activity and a little bit more emphasis on play and social emotional development and that sort of thing. So not only did they appreciate and feel confident in working with preschool programs, but they also saw what some of the lessons learned might apply to to elementary education, which the people in the field in early childhood are very happy to hear, because their biggest worry is that we're going to bring, when we talk about alignment between pre-K and elementary, what we really mean is bringing drill and kill and a complete focus on academics into pre-K, which they think is not developmentally appropriate. So one of the take-home messages that I certainly got in doing this work, and that I hope you will get, is that any particular policy move, there are about 11 other policy moves that need to be made to make it work, so that it doesn't actually do more harm than good. This is an example where a policy move to create greater, stronger linkages between early childhood programs and the elementary school, it sounds good, right? Have the same manager, the same person who's overseeing them, actually, in some cases, did more harm than good, because they didn't do the other policy move, which was create some learning opportunities for the people who are going to have those responsibilities. And you'll see many, many examples of that as I go through these. Teachers, here's where California has really fallen behind. We have relatively low education requirements for people who teach preschool. The highest requirement under Title V is for 24 post-secondary units in early childhood, basically the equivalent of an associate's degree. 34 states now require a bachelor's degree for preschool. I'm not actually pushing a bachelor's degree, because I think in California that may be one of those policy moves that could do more harm than good if it isn't accompanied by developing capacity in higher ed to provide a more practice-oriented program. But we are certainly behind in the amount of education that we require. And I think we could actually play a leadership role in thinking hard about not just should teachers have a bachelor's or not, but what should be the content? What should they learn? What should they be able to do? What kinds of experience should they have before they have the responsibility of 18 or 20 little 3- and 4-year-olds? The other thing about our teacher preparation requirements is I don't want to say this is insane, although the word does come to mind, but it's hard for me to find any kind of rationale for the very different expectations we have depending on what setting teachers are working with children. So this is just 4-year-olds. Let's take a low-income 4-year-old. That 4-year-old could be in a license-exempt family care setting where the provider has no training. She could be in a licensed family child care setting where the provider has 15 hours of health and safety training. In a child care center with 12 hours of EC. All the way up to transitional kindergarten, where the teacher has a bachelor's degree plus a teaching credential, plus 24 hours of early childhood education. So I'm agnostic about which is best. Well, I'm not really agnostic. I won't even pretend to be agnostic. But I'm not going to make the point. The point is simply that where that 4-year-old lands has huge implications for the quality of the child's experience, and not in any kind of rational way as far as I can tell. So one of the things I think we need to do is really look at the way we've set up our system and ask ourselves the question, what's the rationale behind this? And if we can't come up with one, then we need to change it. All right. Moving on to the workforce. Now this, I'm going to tell you something you all know, which is people who are in the field of early childhood education don't make very much money. They're certainly not paid a living wage. They do not get benefits for the most part. Child care providers get an average of $12.29 an hour, and preschool teachers an average of $16.19 an hour. But here's the fact that just blew my mind when I learned it. 58% of people who are child care providers qualify and receive public assistance. There's something wrong with this picture. It's kind of like we're starving them with one hand and then paying them with another out of another. And the other thing, which a lot of people said, well, we just need to make sure that they have BAs, because if they're forced to have BAs, whether it's a good thing or not, whether it makes a better teacher or not, at least we'll be forced to pay them more. We don't pay them very much, even if they do have a BA. So if you look at, now these are just people with BAs. So early childhood teachers who are working with children birth to 3 make on average a little over $27,000. You notice that even within the early childhood field, there's a fair amount of variation from $27,000 to $33,000. And it's one of the reasons why people in the field have told me that they have people who are leaving their state pre-K to go teach in Head Start, because it's $800 more a year. Well, you think $800 more a year, is it really worth it? Well, when you've got such a low base, it's quite a bit of money. But it's still not a livable wage, and it is the reason why we have such a problem now. It's one of the reasons why we have such a problem now staffing, whether it's infant and child care or state pre-K or Head Start or whatever the early learning program is. I have worked with actually folks in this room on trying to increase the requirements for people who are working with young children. And when we shared with the field the idea that we would just increase them a little bit, the feedback we got is, don't you dare, because I'm having a terrible time finding people to teach in my program as it is. You increase the requirements, it's just going to make it worse. So we also have to think about how if you do one thing, again, you have to do some other things. So moving right along through my children with disabilities. This is an area which don't ask me any hard questions about this, because it's an area that I do not have a background in. I learned a lot in the process of working with the author of this piece in the overall early childhood set of reports. These are some of the problems that came out of, or the challenges, or the things we need to worry about, think about, address, that came out of the work that she did. One is there's fragmentation and oversight. This is true across basically everything. Many infants and toddlers are not screened. And the one piece of data that really struck me that kind of brought that home was a chart that showed how many children in each disability category at each age. So in the disability category of autism, for 2-year-olds, there were 95. For 3-year-olds, there were almost 5,000. Now, we can actually identify autism by 2. So I don't think what happened is suddenly children developed autism at the age of 3. They just hadn't been screened and it hadn't been identified. One of the things the research makes very clear is that the earlier you provide services to children, the better they do overall, and also the less costly it is in sort of making up for problems later that are more costly to make up than they would have been to prevent. We also have a fairly low relative to the national average percentage of children who are being served. Now you could say, well, maybe that's because California just has fewer disabled children, but that's probably unlikely. We have if you think we have a shortage of preschool teachers in general, we have a really serious shortage of teachers who have early childhood special ed backgrounds. We also have a shortage of spaces for children in regular programs. California has a larger proportion of children who are in programs that are just for children with disabilities than other states. And we know we have a very strong research-based ethic of least restrictive environment, and that disabled children with disabilities do benefit from being with children who don't have disabilities. But there are very few slots that are available for them. Here's another example of don't fix this without doing some other things. The other problem we have across the country is a lot of preschool kids are getting thrown out of preschool. They're being thrown out because they're behavioral problems. In some places, the solution to that has been to tell teachers and administrators that they have to keep children. They can't tell parents you can't bring your child here anymore. Well, that solves the problem, but it doesn't solves the problem in the numbers game. It doesn't solve the problem in terms of overall children's experience, because then you have a child sometimes with very severe behavioral problems that the teacher is totally unprepared to manage. And so you have havoc in the classroom, which is why so many teachers are trying to get these kids out of their classrooms. So if we're going to make more slots and for children with disabilities, particularly behavioral problems, in regular preschools, we also have to train regular preschool teachers to be able to manage and deal with children with special problems. But the other interesting thing is I saw all this kind of problem here, problem there, and then we look at the data from surveys of parents, and they think their children are being well served, which I guess is a good thing. One last topic, which I'm going to quickly run through, and I'm going to go back a little bit to something that I brought up earlier, which has to do with this alignment between pre-K and the early elementary grades. Presumably, we would want a sort of seamless educational experience for children, so they don't have to adapt to completely different kinds of instruction, and or they don't have to, which is what we're finding, go into kindergarten and end up getting retaught a lot of the things that they had already learned in preschool. National studies and a study in Tennessee and a number of other studies found that regardless of what children had mastered in literacy or math, when they entered kindergarten, teachers were doing mostly very, very basic instruction, much of which was on topics that the kids, or skills that the kids had already mastered. You've probably all heard of fade out, that whatever benefits we get in preschool, often the kids who had the benefit of preschool by third grade, they have disappeared. They look just like the kids who didn't go to preschool. It's not really fade out, it's catch up. So if you're getting repeated in kindergarten the same, over the same material that you've already mastered, you're not learning, and the other kids who hadn't had that opportunity catch up with you. So we really need to think about the continuum between pre-K and kindergarten, so that we're meeting kids where they are at whatever grade, and we're taking them to the next step. So this is very difficult for districts and preschools to try to create greater alignment. One, preschool and TK-12 are just completely separate universes. They're different funding sources and amounts, different management, different standards, different teacher preparation, they're physically separated, although there's more and more efforts to co-locate preschools on early elementary school campuses. And there are a lot of differences in culture and beliefs about what's appropriate for children that you typically find between the people who are serving young children and the people who are in elementary school. There are a number of districts that have really worked hard to try to create better alignment. The two that I described to you, one that is doing it better than the other. A lot of districts have expanded access to pre-K. They've decided
increasingly, there are efforts to co-locate physically the preschool and the elementary school. preschools being administered through the district so that there's some oversight that's common. As I mentioned before, they're increasingly overseen by the elementary school principal. There are some districts that have developed their own curricula that actually flow from pre-K through the elementary grades. There aren't many commercially available. I mentioned there are districts that, at least one district that I know of that is providing a lot of PD for the principals. And some districts, not in California, but especially in some other states, are creating data systems so that they can follow children preschool through elementary school and beyond using disability and so on, so that they can really chart kids' progress and make sure that the people who are teaching kids know where they are when they come into the classrooms. As we have interviewed many of the superintendents and administrators that have been trying to do this, they have shared with us a number of challenges, and these are the challenges that the state actually is connected to state policy. One is pre-K, which is underfunded. The fragmentation in standards and accountability that we talked about, especially if they're trying to weave together funding from different support resources. They find it's very difficult to provide joint professional development and collaboration because the pre-K, most pre-K teachers are there all day with their kids. They don't have time available. They're often there until 5 or 6 and don't have after school time. They're on completely different schedules. There's different culture and beliefs that I mentioned before. There are a few curricula and assessments available that are validated, that they have to create some kind of continuity. We do not have any state assessments, basically. We don't give state assessments pre-K through second grade. Basically, the required state assessments start at third grade. So if you want to track kids better than, you have to create your own. And that, of course, is burdensome, demanding. Many districts, particularly small districts, don't have the capacity to be able to do that. But it's critically important. And principals don't have any requirements in their training program to be credentialed as an elementary school principal. You don't have to have any training in early childhood education. By the way, if anybody wants a copy of these slides, I don't charge very much. Actually, I could use these to take a copy. Okay, last topic. I thought that was the last topic. I forgot about data. And I'm just going to say, I was told when I consulted with a colleague, well, what's the message that I should make sure these people hear? She said, data, data, data. So we have very little data for families, providers, decision makers. We don't know very much about programs. We don't know about staffing. We don't know who are the staff, what their education levels are, what the turnover is. One of the frustrations of doing these reports is finding any evidence that could actually tell me something about the state of California as opposed to Los Angeles County or some very small places where they do make an effort to try to collect some data. So, and this has an impact on families. Figuring out what they're eligible for is difficult. Which programs meet their needs. Getting any information on the quality of the programs. Providers, it's not that easy to find kids for slots. There are some organizations, some enterprising people who created these websites, like there's one in San Francisco and a couple of communities in California where parents can go to this website and it connects them, somehow connects them with where there's slots available. But it's like these little pockets of things that are happening. Providers don't have information that they can use to improve quality or to assess their children and track the children's development over time. And then finally, for decision makers, we don't have a centralized data system. The data is fragmented by age and by sector, and it's very difficult to assess the impact of any policy changes. So let's say, for example, we did increase the requirements for people who teach preschool. We wouldn't have any way to find out whether, in fact, that improved the quality of preschool or improved child outcomes. When you're going to make a heavy-duty investment, both from the state's perspective and from individual perspective, you want some way of being able to determine whether that investment was worth it. So if we're going to move forward in making some real investments in early childhood, I think we also want to invest in an infrastructure so we can track how well we're doing and what we're accomplishing. And that is the end.
So we're going to open it up to Q&A, and while the first person asks a question, we're going to have the tech come up really quickly and replace your batteries.
Oh, my battery's dead?
So we'll kind of be in the background on that, but so we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, things that you'd like to hear from Deborah about.
This can also be a conversation. There are a lot of people in this room who know a lot. Some of them in the room where I got some of the information. So feel free to answer a question or to talk to each other. I just think this is a real opportunity where people
who care about these issues, but work in different agencies in different places, could be communicating with each other. Erin.
I am curious about, I work for the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. So you were talking about addressing the needs of students, like special ed students in preschool.
Yeah.
And we do have an early childhood special education credential on the books.
I know, but people aren't going into it.
Right, but so I guess I'm wondering, if you see an advantage or a disadvantage to one or the other, either adding a significant amount of more curriculum or preparation for these teachers in working with children with special needs at a very young age, or perhaps special ed to come in and do, provide kind of special services to these kids so that the teachers themselves don't have to become the specialists.
I think for the most part, and again, I'm a little bit out of my area of expertise, maybe somebody else will know the answer to this better, but a lot of those specialists who actually have a credential are working with just children who have disabilities. From what I understand, sort of pull-out programs where you have kids in regular classrooms, I mean, they may be pulled out for speech and hearing and things like that, but behavioral problems and that sort of thing, that's an all-day, everyday issue. So, and we do want to allow children who have disabilities to be with other children who don't. So to the degree that we want that least restrictive environment, and I think we do, then we have to prepare teachers to be able to deal with the kinds of management issues that they sometimes create. It's not really much of a loss in a way, even though it's maybe a little bit costly to add that to their demands. Most teachers, whenever we do surveys of what kinds of issues do you want professional development on, management turns out to be almost always the first thing they ask for. Unfortunately for me, because I work in the field of early math, they don't say I want to learn more about how to teach math. But management is always a top issue. And so it's on a continuum. There are kids, at some point, they're identified as having a behavioral problem that's so severe they get labeled. But there are a lot of other kids in those classrooms who are still challenging teachers. So I think we need to do both.
I'm curious to know about some of the standards that may be developed in terms of talking about high quality standards and how it varies by county. But I'm curious to know if you might have looked at other countries in terms of what they might have done in the early childhood space, whether, because, part of why we're talking about all this stuff is our competition with other countries.
Yeah,
in terms of
yeah.
being competitive. So I'm curious to know, kind of what have we learned from other countries and what we actually do.
Yes, I actually taught once a comparative course on policies for children and families. And I think, to put it in a nutshell, Most other countries put a lot more into the training of the people who are the teachers and caregivers, but they also have higher class size. I mean, that's sort of the trade-off. And in K-12 education as well as early childhood, the US has opted for smaller class sizes. Well, to keep the costs from skyrocketing, the trade-off has been we don't put as much into training the people who are providing the teaching. I personally think we go too far, and we need to put, I want to say we want it all. We want small class sizes, and we want better training and higher pay. I understand that we have to make trade-offs, and I do not want to be quoted as saying we should have much larger class sizes, because that will, I'll start getting death threats from practitioners. But we have to understand that that's a trade-off. And we definitely, whatever we do with class sizes, we have to invest more, because quite honestly, I spend a lot of time in early childhood programs, and the quality is low. I mean, it really is not where most of us would want to have our kids. They are people, especially people who are not well trained, but they also are living in poverty themselves. And so we know that the depression and stress and anxiety and some of the things that we know are more common or more prominent in people who are very low income, we see the same thing in caregivers. So I know the inclination is to provide more access at a legislative and at a policy level, because that's what legislators get credit for. But I really, really strongly urge us to resist doing that without also investing in quality. And that's not to say that we have severe problems with access.
I really appreciated the length and depth of the technical paper. I can't say that
You're the only one, I think, that appreciated the length.
I can't say that there were sections that I didn't get at all, but I appreciated. It was alarming, and it was overwhelming. And having been in the field for decades, some of you know I'm old enough to be a grandmother, I really, on the one hand, thought about, well, we've tried to create a single system. I've like 4 decades, every decade we have a couple of efforts, and there are, you didn't discuss what are the lessons to be learned about why we couldn't do it, and how has this time given us the opportunity. A lot of us worked really hard to protect programs and keep them in the Department of Education because of all the things about low quality, et cetera. For years, we did all these things. And then we found, in the Great Recession, we lost $1 billion.
Yeah.
So we lost, it was the default, right? We lost the resources and the protections, but we didn't create the system, right? Okay, so there was all these things that I thought about when I was reading it, and one of the things that immediately got me really is that I've been working to support dual language learners my whole career. Back in the day, we called it bilingual when I started, and it was supported because we were under RILES, and we had an early childhood credential, and I got one of them. Now, then we got through this whole anti-immigrant, anti-language, anti-people of color time, 87, 227.
Remember it well.
Okay, we all remember that. And we had only 22% Latinos, and now we have 60% dual language learners of many languages, and the Asian languages are increasing. And we adopted systems that gave us numbers. There are a lot of them, 27%, 22%, 27%, and now 60%. And we mentioned it, and you highlighted it right up in front. But then the rest of the discussion is silent. on the policies, whether it's teacher preparation or principal preparation or licensing obstacles or monitoring of QRIS standards and performance, they become the universal child. So the majority kids now, the dual language learners of all these languages and cultures, are present kind of in the atmosphere, but they are not in CTC, you know? Oh my God, where's BLL? Where's play? We have found that there's this kind of universal, good child care is good for everybody, but it does not make visible. The policy doesn't trickle down or expand, you know, create a synergy to really respond to the things you talked about initially, which is achievement gap. And teacher and competencies and teacher prep, et cetera. So how do, and I know that this is massive. What do you think what can we do to bring the visibility as we look at every policy and the consequences of every policy so that DLLs are not just kind of like the horizon?
I don't have, as you can imagine, a simple answer to that. The report that I did really didn't get to that level. It was more, what do we do in California? I think that as we reinvent in California the way we support young children and families, one, in addition to streamlining that complicated set of agencies and so on, every level needs to think about who are our children. I mean, every level. Now, I can tell you, I worked with Aaron, for example, on teacher competencies that they're trying to develop that could feed into whatever kinds of requirements we create or what kind of assessment tools we use or whatever. And I know that dual language, addressing the needs of dual language children is in their competencies on every other page. I mean, it's really been a theme throughout. Partly because the people at the table are concerned about that. So one of the things is when we're thinking about program changes, we have to have someone at the table always who is a strong advocate and who can keep reminding us of it. I think one of the reasons why we avoid it is we don't quite know what to do with it. And so it's kind of like, oh yeah, don't forget dual language learners. But we don't actually do something because we're not sure. So even in Aaron's work, what is the competency that is needed to be able to meet the needs of dual language learners? What do you need to know?
Can I say around that, the competencies, because I've been working on them and studying them and poring over them, you know, the proposed, the early childhood competencies that West Ed and the Department of Ed, and we
all 42,000 of them?
Were pre-Prop 227.
Yeah, yeah.
So they were the best, no, not best, the acceptable statements under the California social political environment.
Yeah. Yeah, but
we're not talking
but we're starting fresh now. We have a new opportunity now, and I think the public and I think there's more acknowledgement, more acceptance of that, and we in the room who are going to be engaged in creating new policies, we need to keep that front and center. Samantha?
So kind of building on that question, I mean, I know one of the things that you touched on in the research and that we're also struggling with is just the lack of data on our workforce.
Yeah.
Because we do know the workforce is much more diverse, right?
Yeah.
So there's a real opportunity here to lift up the workforce, but that's going to take real concerted effort to build that pipeline and to make sure that we have the structures in place systematically. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the lack of workforce data and kind of in the field generally and how we might embrace the workforce we have.
The lack of workforce data is, as you say, we don't know who's out in there, who's out in the field, and we don't know what languages they speak. One of the things, but it's a really good example of don't do A without doing B. So again, if we just increase the requirements, including strong requirements for knowledge of dual language learners and language development and that sort of thing, we're going to create a less diverse workforce. So the consequence of that is we'll have fewer people who speak the languages that the children speak, or who have the culture and backgrounds that that many of our children have. So what do we have to do to make sure that that doesn't happen? We have to make sure that we provide a lot of resources and scholarships and opportunities for them to meet those more rigorous requirements. So it's just an example of where at every point in the policy-making place we're in, we have to keep in mind who our children are and who our families are. Same thing with families don't work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. So if we want to do childcare, we have to think about what do we really need to do to meet the family's needs. We have to keep our population and their needs in mind throughout. But I'm excited because I think we do have an opportunity now to kind of reset the table. I'm hoping that as a state, we won't just kind of tweak this and that we'll really look at the whole picture and what kinds of significant changes we can make to create a more sane, more rational system that is efficient and meets the needs of children and families. That should have been my final statement, but anyway. Another question?
One more question.
Yeah, one more question.
In terms of preschool inclusion, we're far behind other states, and there's lots of emerging models in terms of how to have someone with early childhood special ed supporting preschool classrooms, how co-teaching is viable, and so that's one piece. And the other piece is I also participated with a federal early childhood professional development group associated with ECTA. And, you know, through their presentation, they were talking about competencies and other issues like that. But the pay just doesn't support the burden.
I know. I know.
And they were saying 14, 30. I mean, until that social justice issue is kind of remedied in some way, I think it's hard to really put additional requirements.
You can't. You absolutely cannot. Well, I think we can look at other states. I will finish with this suggestion, which is we have pockets of innovation in California. There are, for example, counties that have created collaborations among the various agencies and that meet together and really think about the county's services for young children and families in a comprehensive, collaborative way. There are districts that have done a lot to try to expand access to preschool, create quality, and connect it with the early elementary grades. So there are pockets of excellence and innovation that we should look to. There are also other states, and I think we want to be careful that we look at some of those other states and how they've organized, especially if we, I don't want to say start from scratch, but really clear the table and think about how would we create a sane and rational system. So there are models around the country, in our own state, and certainly around the world. And I would encourage us all to be mindful of those models and not just sort of live with what we have and try to tweak it. So I'm going to just tell you all, I really want to thank you and look forward to working with you in bringing some of this new knowledge or summarized knowledge to bear on the policies that we create.